Perfect. I think we can begin. Let's start with introductions. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Hope you're having a wonderful Friday afternoon. Um, and yeah, welcome to this conversation. I have hosted one webinar for grief on the Sakeenah platform earlier this year. But I find that this is one conversation that can happen as many times as we need. In a different context, and you learn why this is so relevant in our lives, regardless of what is happening around us, but specifically right now with the current events happening in the world, especially in the Middle East, that are very close. They're far from us in terms of geographical distance, but very close to our hearts, and that's why we can really feel the impact of it in our day-to-day lives as well, which makes this conversation very relevant for all of us joining here. All of humanity, really, regardless of which faith we belong to. But specifically today, we're going to be speaking about how the events that happen around us really are happening to us, and how our faith, practicing faith and spirituality, but specifically from the lens and framework of our faith system and religious practices, acts as a protective factor for our mental health and helps us make sense of our life. And since grief is one aspect that touches every aspect of our life, how is faith going to be able to assist to meaning making in that process? And I'll begin with introductions. My name is Shamyle. I'm a mental health counselor here at Sakeenah Canada. We are a shelter organization who provides services for women and children specifically. And we also have counseling programs that are in-house and remote. So anybody looking for support can definitely reach out and we'll be able to assist them. As part of our mental health initiative, we also do webinars and we're trying to keep consistent in that and serve the community in different ways that we can. And today I have our esteemed guest with us that I'm really excited to speak to and learn from, Runda Ebied. And she's an occupational therapist and has deep interest in mental health, and we're so happy that she is pursuing that interest and giving back to her community in different ways. And we see her providing her services and just sharing her insights and perspectives that are very rich and insightful with everybody. And she's been doing a lot of that, and you can see her primarily on the Root Care platform right now. And I'll also invite you to say more on that, Runda, a little bit about yourself before we begin.
Thank you, Shamyle. Jazakallah khair. It's always an honor to collaborate with community organizations and institutions, especially Sakeenah Homes. I love the work that you're doing. It's incredibly transformational and needed and necessary and powerful. So I'm very honored to be here with you today. I've always kind of had a passion for mental health from kind of the outset of my career. And then it turned into maternal mental health. And just after I became a mother, became a lot more interested in that. And then now as a pediatric therapist working with children, I just see how much of an impact our well-being can really affect every aspect of our life and our functioning and our relationships, and how important it is for us to feel like we can talk about these things. Like these things shouldn't be taboo, or we shouldn't ever be kind of shamed or criticized when we bring up the concept of I don't feel well. This whole and honestly, this past year or over a year now, I think collectively and globally, all around the world, we've been feeling this collective weight of what's been happening. So, if we're not going to talk about it, if we're not going to be able to share with each other how we're feeling and how to cope with it, it just becomes that much harder to deal with it. So I'm very honored to be able to speak to this topic and share some of my thoughts and just to be here with you today.
Yeah, inshallah. And I hope that the audience here with us is going to feel like they're a part of the conversation as well. The chat is going to be open for you to make your contributions, ask questions, or leave your comments or reflections. And then towards the end, we will be opening your the audio. We'll unmute you so you can participate that way as well. Before we get into having a conversation about what grief is, talking more about um, what are the more fine elements within grief. It's not just, oftentimes we take it as, oh, an enmeshed, a lot happens there, but then that can feel a lot if you're not dissecting it, right? And when we tease it apart, and we'll be able to take it chunk by chunk and then understand it more and how it reflects in our life. I do want to say that this conversation is primarily geared towards adults, and then adults can take that information and process and support children and teens around them. But specifically, this is going to be about how grown-ups are going to be affected by uh, just events around the world right now, specific to the genocide happening right now, um, and then specific to from thereafter, how do you take care of yourself and how do you reconcile with the fact that this is happening in the same world as you are existing and just waking up and going to work and going about your day as normal. So how do you reconcile the polarity of this? So with that, I would actually want to give it to you first, Runda, and hear from you. A little bit about like what grief is. Are there different types of grief? And, you know, does it always come after we've experienced certain loss? Are
Mhm.
all losses the same? Some are heavier than others. Like, can you share your perspective on this, please?
Sure, inshallah. So I'll start off with a quote that I read in a book, and I feel like it's a very it's just a very nice quote that I read, and it made me think a lot. So I'll just start off with that, and then inshallah I'll get into the other aspects.
Mm,
So it says, "The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will learn to live with it. You will heal, and you will rebuild yourself around the loss that you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to." And so this is a quote by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who writes a lot about grief. She has a lot of work out there if you're interested. It's not Islamically oriented, all of it, but it just has some really important insights about grief. So the thing with grief, it involves any type of loss. And we sometimes associate this with death, like the death of a loved one. And that's
mm,
definitely a big component of grief. But I look at grief as being any loss. The loss of a job, we grieve that. The loss of a relationship or of a friendship. Divorce, that's a loss. That's considered a huge loss, right? In terms of many different aspects. The loss of an opportunity,
mm,
the loss of trust. There's so many different types of losses, and I feel like over the last year, again, with what we've been witnessing, there's a lot of like a huge loss in terms of loss of lives, loss of safety, loss of justice, right? So many different types of loss that we are all trying to grieve and try to figure out what to do with all of this with all of this loss, because with loss comes a feeling of insecurity and
mm,
instability. And it becomes very hard to figure out how to move forward in the world when you're feeling this profound sense of loss in so many different ways. And there's all
mm,
these layers to it, right? Islamophobia, that's a loss of safety, right? Insecurity and belonging, right? So there's so many aspects of it. And all of that boils down to this big concept of grief. I'm grieving
mm,
that I have to go through my life with a lack of these things or with a loss of these things.
mm,
So the thing with grief is there are definitely many types of it, and it doesn't always happen after an event. There's
mm,
something called anticipatory grief, where, for example, if a loved one or a friend is ill,
mm.
terminally ill, and you know that
Yeah.
time is coming, that you're feeling all that anticipatory grief, like you haven't lost them yet, they haven't passed away yet, but you're feeling all those feelings of grief already. Like, how was my life going to look like when they're not here? Um,
Mm,
all of these different aspects that you're thinking about. So you're dealing with the grief up front, and then the event happens where the person passes away, and then it's a completely different type of grief. Usually it starts off typically with this acute sense of grief, which is this overwhelming shock of what do I do? How do I get through the day? What do I fill my time with, especially for caregivers who've been looking after someone who's been unwell, and then they
mm,
pass away, it's like this complete void in their life. What do I even fill it with? So again, there's this big emotional, dip that comes, and then and we all know about kind of the 5 stages of grief and how we weave in and out of
mm,
them, right? And it's never linear. We go back to one, we go forward, we cycle through them in very different ways. Sometimes there's a bit of denial, sometimes
mm,
there's anger sometimes, like, I don't know how this all happened or how could this happen? And we
Yeah.
start questioning different aspects of the event and maybe even of our faith sometimes. So that's kind of one of the main types of grief we feel before an event, directly after an event. One of the types of grief I've talked about a lot over this past year is disenfranchised grief, which is where you feel like you're grieving and you can't really talk about it with anyone. Like, it's not
Mm.
something that's publicly supported. So you just might feel like you have to keep that grief all inside. So, for example, with what's happening in Palestine, you want to talk about it to anyone and everyone that you see, your
Yeah.
colleagues at work, your neighbors, and you're going through your day with this huge sense of grief and loss, and you don't know who to talk to about it. Or you might feel shut down if you do talk about it, or politically or legally
Mm.
at work, you might be told, "Stop talking about this."
Yeah.
So it's like this disenfranchised grief that I'm having all these emotions and I can't even talk about them or process them properly.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, there's a lot, there's a lot of insights that you've
Mhm.
shared here. And I think that, when you were kind of taking us through that process of the anticipatory grief, right? I feel like with specifically this crisis, we are stuck in all sorts of grief, I feel. There's all kinds of these grief elements, and then perspectives that have taken root. Like, we anticipate what how can it get worse, and then it does, and then we're like, oh, it challenges our imagination, and so we're anticipating what next, right? Yes, there is hope, and that keeps us there, but that doesn't take away from the grief. Both are present, and it sometimes becomes very difficult to make room for both, right? Because they
Yeah,
can feel so contradictory at times. And then the disenfranchised grief that you're talking about, I feel like all of these have, we can't really, right now with this specific crisis, can't really be seeing them as separate. Yes, that might help us understand ourselves better, but it's just a compounded effect at this point.
yeah,
And where, yes, as a collective, it will make us question a lot about the kind of groups we are part of, the kind of neighborhood we are part of, right? How are we safe? Like, what do we identify with? It can also shake us, that insecurity, right? The rocky, like, our foundation is like, um, is shaky right now, right? So grief also makes you go inward and ask yourself, like, who am I? What do I stand for? How much do I stand for certain things, right? What does that look like in my life? What am I doing for it? Um, and there's going to be many people and different kinds of people who would want to do a lot, but they will find themselves to be limited by either circumstance or resource or there are some people who feel guilty that they cannot keep up with the news that's coming in because that is going to make them dysfunctional in their lives, and they have responsibilities that they have to fulfill. So there is a lot of conflict that grief brings in as well, within ourselves, within our personhood, right?
yeah,
Um, we could look at it as a side effect of grief or as a symptom of grief. But then I also wanted to open conversation about, if this is happening and we are looking at it from the perspective of faith, like whatever is going to happen to me, I will have the capacity to bear the weight of it. That's part of our belief, right? Otherwise, it's not going to come up in my life. How do
yeah.
we then use faith to build capacity and the skill to bear this weight?
Yeah, excellent question. And I always look at it as the faith. So even from the research for that's not done by Muslims, it's just the research that's out there. Faith is a significant protective factor when it
Mm.
comes to life's challenges. Now, having said that, I always like to dispel some of the myths that if you have a strong sense of faith, you're not going to struggle. I'm like,
Mm.
let's toss that out the window. It's just not, because then all that does is it just puts people into a corner that you shouldn't be seeking help or you shouldn't be struggling so much. Like, you lose a loved one, you should just be able to, move on and be okay. And that's just not even that's not the Islamic way of looking at it. And when you study the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam's life, I love reading about how he dealt with these things because I think he
Yeah.
had the perfect recipe. I really do. He got emotions. He understood emotions. He exemplified how to be emotionally intelligent and emotionally resilient to all the companions where at a time you think back
Mm.
to the context, I don't think people were really, thinking a lot about this whole emotional resilience
Yeah.
capacity. It was a very different world back then, but subhanAllah, he came, alayhi salatu wasalam, and he showed the world, he showed people emotions are very important. They're messengers. It's
Yeah.
coming to tell you that something is
Yeah.
right and you need to look after it. And it's okay to feel sad. Like there are many stories in the Sira of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, of him feeling sad and grieving. He lost so many
Yeah.
people. Like his story is a story of so much there was so much loss of loved ones and people that were his main supporters, right? Like
Yeah.
Khadija radiallahu anha, his uncle, his mother, so many people that were cornerstones in his life, and he lost them, and he showed that emotion. He didn't shy away from it. He didn't say, I have to put on a front. He expressed emotions to the point where, when Hamza, when his uncle was killed, like they could hear him cry, and it wasn't just crying. It was that feeling when when someone's crying so hard they can't breathe.
Yeah.
So, and these are all well documented. Like this is very, very much prophetic. That
Yeah.
feeling sad and grieving is a part of that healing process. And I always say
Mm.
you can't heal what you don't feel. So if we keep suppressing or thinking, I shouldn't feel this way,
Yeah.
all that does is just make this much it's just delaying that whole healing process and it's complicating it so much more. So how did he
Yeah.
deal with this? He felt his emotions, he
Mm.
expressed them, he showed people it's okay to feel emotions. He's a human being, and he
Mm.
was probably the most person in this entire world that understood destiny and fate, and his faith was incomparable to any of ours. So it's not that he didn't accept it, he accepted it fully. He accepted that decree, right? And in the story of losing his son Ibrahim, how he said that beautiful saying, like the eyes shed tears and the heart feels sorrow, and we only say that which pleases our Lord. So that's the recipe. He felt the pain, he felt the sorrow, he felt the grief, and he had full acceptance in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. And he used that acceptance and that trust that he had in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? He knew Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he knew him by in his attributes, that he's the all-knowing, he's the most merciful, he's the most compassionate, and kind of tapping into those beautiful names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that help us stay grounded, like help
Mm.
us stay balanced. Like I know this is really hard, and it's okay for it to feel hard because it is hard, not because I'm
Mm.
grieving wrong. There's no way to grieve wrong. I'm going through a huge adjustment in my life and an emotional roller coaster. Really, that's what it is. And it's okay for me to feel that way. And I'm going to use my faith as the thing that anchors me versus the thing that makes me feel like I shouldn't be feeling this way. It's the thing that, on those days where that wave of grief hits much harder, because there will be days where it gets much harder than other days. Like some days you'll be able to get through your day. You're like, I think I'm fine today. And then something happens, like a trigger or a reminder, and we're swept with that wave of grief. It's the faith that I find really, really anchors us. So we learn
Yeah.
those really important coping tools, right? All the things that we learn in therapy to help us with our grief process and our grief journey. But then I use faith as it's my my crash mat. It's the thing
Yeah.
that I'm gonna land on when I feel like the rug's been swept from under me.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? Again, kind of like I mentioned, we read the stories of the Prophet ﷺ, how he dealt with grief. All the
Mm.
prophets had cities
Yeah.
and trials, and their faith was unshakable. How he dealt with it, that acceptance, that tawakkul, that I can add elements into my day to help me get through my day, where I don't have to wait for me being swept over by that wave of grief for me to really start thinking about coping strategies. So it's like sustainable practices, the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that keeps us going, right? Again, I'm connecting my day, I'm connecting myself to my creator.
Yeah.
It helps me feel not alone. Like you don't have to go through your day feeling like you're just you're all you've got.
Yeah.
You go back to connecting yourself with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He's the sustainer, He's the protector, He's the
Yeah.
all-knowing, He's got me. That
Mm.
in and of itself is a significant protective factor for those really, really difficult days. Doesn't mean we won't have them, but it'll be the thing that keeps us from crumbling.
Yeah.
So I
Wow.
find that's really helpful, and just there's countless stories, right, in the Quran. I feel like the more we connect ourselves to those stories and to our roots. Like these are our roots. I find the work of Dr. Dania Awad is incredible in her work of studying how mental health was actually born out of so many of our Islamic scholars.
Yeah.
You study the history of our Islamic history. The scholar by the name of Al-Balkhi, like he
Mm,
established the whole concept of talk therapy. Like we got that, we did that,
mm,
and then you find that there's still so much stigma about going to someone and talking about your challenges, but that's very much rooted in our Islamic
mhm.
history. That we were the founders. Sometimes Muslims were the founders and pioneers of what it meant to take care of someone who's struggling. And in a day and age where you read about that age, kind of the dark
Mm,
ages, where people who were struggling with their mental health were cast away or put away, locked up.
yeah.
And Muslim scholars came and said, no, no, like this is something that needs to be carefully nurtured and tended to. And this person's heart and their soul and their mind
Mhm.
need to be taken care of in a very holistic sense, from
Mm,
a religious sense, from a physical sense, sleep,
yeah.
eating well, exercise, being in nature, being surrounded by people who love you and support you, medications, however it is that it's this whole picture to help somebody cope with grief. And then faith comes and it's like the glue that puts everything together.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed you connecting just the way grief often depletes us of our resource, and then you connected that with, go back to the sustainer, that, you know, the one the
Mhm.
one being that will be able to sustain us, because that's where we're coming from, right? That's Yeah, that's the promise, right? That we will ask and he will sustain us.
Yeah,
And we oftentimes, of course, with the cognitive element of grief, and not just the emotional, the cognitive element of grief can be really, really challenging. It
yeah,
can keep us stuck in the questioning phase of why me, why this way. And those are valid questions, but those are questions that if we ask from a place of, I need to know, they're not going to really lead to an answer. But if we ask from a place of, okay, this has happened and I don't know why this happened, so I'm curious, why did it happen? That's
mhm,
when you go inward, right? So grief really is an unwelcome guest in our lives.
mhm.
Um, and it can wear a very horrible, very scary mask,
Yeah,
but it's an experience, it's an emotion, and we have to, when we come in with an understanding of, oh, this is my emotion and it's going to point to a need, like you said, it's a messenger, right?
yeah,
So it is going to take me to my need, no matter what it looks like, no matter what it feels like. It has rough edges, it's difficult to keep in. Just
mhm,
we are to take its lead and we trust that process. It is going to help us connect better with our own selves and then where we're coming from. So loss is this way, right? But
mhm.
then we go back into, okay, where are we coming from? And
Yeah,
how do I make sense of this loss? And it's very interesting. One of my earlier things that I learned in my grief counseling training was, yes, grief is going to like touch all aspects of your life, but then you will expand.
yeah,
Your life will expand around it, right? Like you said in the quote that you shared earlier on, you will grow around that
mhm,
experience. And it's never going to leave, but your life is going to be more than that. So when you go back inward and then come out, you will come out of it,
yeah,
it will stay there, sure. But then your the other experience of grief, so the first experience of grief and the second experience of grief, they're never the same. No
yeah,
two experiences of grief are going to be the same. But the important element is that you do not lose sight of yourself in the process,
mm,
right?
mhm,
You do participate in that grief process. You are grieving versus I'm grieving is going to be two very different processes, but we can interact, and it has to be very specific to you. So I would, my emphasis for anybody grieving through any life change, really, like you said, that we can experience grief before loss, after loss, and anticipation of loss. Um, this could be life transition. This could be moving countries. This could be switching jobs. This could be
mhm,
entering a different life role, right?
yeah,
From being single to getting married to being a parent to, you know, your kids going to school and then to high school and then off to college. These are different life phases that you have to adjust to as well. So one thing that is going to help, and I've seen that in my clients as well, is just that just nurturing that element of curiosity
Yes.
towards your own experience. That helps you expand as an individual. So when you said that, yes, we can find, I feel like whatever topic we're going to speak about, we can we would feel like, oh, there's a guide in the hadith of the prophet for this,
Mm.
right? So it feels like his life was made for all of the topics that we'll ever speak about, right? It's so
Yeah.
complete. Um, so going back to his life, and he's really shown us how to do it. um, but when you were quoting, from the Sira, you were also talking about how people around him were like,
Yeah.
right? How people during that time were. They were ready to learn. They were interactive. They were open to experience and questioning. And oftentimes, what I've seen is that it is sometimes we want our loved ones to get better, right? To come out of it. Um, and that's well and good, but they might not be ready for it just yet.
Yeah.
That might not be the pace at which they're grieving right now,
Mm.
right? Or uh, oftentimes in cultures, like because culture and religion can sometimes come in conflict with each other,
Yeah.
cultures can really push somebody to feel now because you've lost somebody or because you've lost something in your life, while
Mm.
the person is probably in a state of shock and doesn't have the capacity to feel a lot of feelings right now, but they're getting by,
Right.
right? It's not their time. So when you said that there is no wrong way of grieving, I would absolutely add more affirmation to it. Yes, there is no right or wrong way of feeling grief or going through grief. But one thing that is going to be crucial for anybody grieving is the people they surround themselves with, the
Yeah.
kind of environments they enter or choose not to enter. That's going to have an impact on if they're going to experience the grief in a complicated way. Is it going to become more complex for them? Or is it just going to be a smoother process for them? As smooth as grief can be. Um, yeah, yeah. Um, I would want to lead the conversation a little bit into how, yes, faith is one of the best protective factors in mental health that we are aware of through research. No religious or spiritual element involved, like pure quantitative research, right? But it is also true that when we are grieving, a lot of people will question their faith, right? That they have been subjected to a loss, and that might be a punishment, or that might be a trial in their life, or why me, and they can really get stuck in that. And especially, it can be contradictory, but I've also seen people who have um, a lot of practice around their faith when they experience a loss that they never imagined that they would.
Mhm.
They really stop and pause and think, what did I do wrong to deserve this? Right? And it seems like there's an intellectual and emotional divide in them, right?
Yeah.
They know other things, like they know why, like what religion teaches us, but when they experience it, the emotions really kind of block them from connecting with the intellect bit.
Mm.
How do we go about that? Because that can be really um, they can put them at risk as well because they're not able to access a great resource that they have cultivated in their life.
Yeah, this is such a hard part of the whole grief journey is when we try to intellectualize it too much.
Mm,
When we try to use our mind over our heart. And as you'll see in a lot of like Islamic, even tazkiyah, like self purification, a lot of Islamic psychology work is
yeah,
about centering the heart over the mind.
yeah,
That we sometimes try to intellectualize so much of our religion and of our lives. And did this experience happen because, oh, maybe I did something 5 years ago and now this is a punishment for that?
yeah,
That just becomes this big, huge rabbit hole that we dig sometimes for ourselves and we can't get out, and then we lose focus of what we're actually trying to do here. So
Mm,
I've been tested with something really, really difficult. If my focus is just to sit there, figure out why I'm being tested with this, that's taking away all my resources from being able to cope with it. And I'm just
mm,
going to end up in such a huge, ball of distress that
mm,
getting through my day and functioning and getting through with this grief and kind of deriving the wisdom and the lesson from this test
mm,
are not happening because I'm too busy trying to intellectualize something that I don't have the capacity for. Like, when you study kind of aqidah and our reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our acceptance and belief in his oneness and his knowledge and his omnipotence and all of that, it's that there is a line that we have to understand where we end and
mm,
the knowledge of the unknown begins, right? That I have certain knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me the ability to acquire and to understand in this world, in this life, the dunya. And then there's a lot of knowledge that I do not have the capacity with my limited intellect to be able to comprehend and to do something with it. And
mm,
that's where again we always come back to that tawakkul and reliance that is this is this really something I need to know? Like, when you
mm,
look at it from a coping perspective, like me figuring out why I'm going through this, or figuring out if this is a punishment or a test, or all this stuff that we start to really preoccupy ourselves with, is that actually helping me or harming me? And that's a
mm,
question I give a lot of my clients that when you're going through a hard time or you're struggling, really ask yourself and be honest with yourself. Is what I'm
mm,
doing now helping me or harming me? Is this certain practice that I'm doing, this coping mechanism, is it helping me or harming me? And I think the same with our thoughts, the thought process that we start to go down.
yeah,
Most of the time, it's harming us. These thought processes that we go down doesn't mean we can't think and comprehend and try to connect some dots. But if
yeah,
that's all we're doing, we're not leaving enough resources for us to cope with it. And the thing
yeah,
with our brains, how they work is that when you're able to kind of figure out the emotional aspect of things. So right now, I'm feeling confused, disappointed. I'm grieving. I'm feeling alone. Like when you're able to really verbalize that to yourself and figure that piece out, like really try and think to yourself, what am I feeling about this whole situation? And acknowledging that and recognizing that, then your brain is actually able to help you cope with it. Like the more granular we can be about our
yeah,
emotions, the more then our
yeah,
brain is like, okay, I know how to help you deal with this emotion. But if all
yeah,
I'm doing is I'm just sticking up here, that process just won't happen as smoothly
yeah,
unless you're sitting like with a therapist and they're able to kind of walk you through that. But a lot of the time, we're just doing this whole process on our own about trying to intellectualize things. So when we start to think, why me? It honestly just leads us down a very, very fruitless path
mm,
of our coping. And then we start to develop, that's where a lot of people start questioning their faith and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and it. And instead of them coming closer to it, which is their absolute lifeline,
yeah,
detracts them from it, which makes it even harder for them to cope and it makes it worse for them. Versus when we can say, Ya Allah, this is really hard for me. I don't understand why I'm going through this. You know, and that's enough for me to know
yeah,
that you are the one that's controlling all my affairs.
yeah,
I am seeking your help to get through this because I don't understand it, but I need help getting through it.
yeah,
It's really being honest, invoking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, asking again our sustainer, the one who created us, the one who knows us better than we know ourselves and loves us and
yeah,
wants us to heal. Like when you look at, for example, the things we've been asked to do in Islam, like praying and reading Surah Al-Fatiha, like they say Surah Al-Fatiha is also called like the healer. So imagine Allah
mm,
subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it so that we have to read it at least 17 times a day. He wants healing for us. He wants us to feel better. He wants us to come closer to him. But if I'm spending all that time just questioning why Allah subhanahu has put me through this, it's tempting to do that. It's very tempting to go down that path because basically what you're doing is you're ignoring the emotional aspect of things, which
yeah,
people don't like to get to.
yeah,
We don't like to think about emotions and unravel that, and it's very vulnerable and can lead us, and
yeah,
sitting with all that baggage, it's really hard. So we're like, let me just focus on the intellectual part of it because it's easy.
yeah,
But again, it's at our detriment.
yeah. No, I really like how you, um, phrased it in a way that it leads us to think the relationship with our creator is, well, it can be a conversation. It is a conversation, right? We just have to participate in that conversation.
Yeah.
And if our hurt is going to be that avenue that leads us closer to our creator, then we can use it. And I think that any experience that we have in life, of course, is just just an avenue of us reaching out back to our creator. Because there is this his lecture I was listening by Sheikh Abdul Rahman Murphy from
Mhm.
the Roots community in Texas.
Mhm.
And it, somebody asked a similar question, and he said, well, in times like this, we just, ask yourself, like, who moved,
Yeah.
right? Because he's always there. And, you can always reach back. And I think that conversation of just being humble about it, like, I
Mhm.
don't know. And that's why I keep asking myself this question. And maybe if I can't figure out with all my intellect and all my research, I still can't, then maybe just can't, and then just put that weight down, and not, not having to drag it with you. And then in 5 years or 10 years, I'll be able to figure out where there is an opportunity for you to put that down, and with somebody that existence, their creator, that is going to take better care of it than you
Yeah.
ever will be able to, right?
Mhm.
Another thing that I've learned from just listening to lectures and just getting that perspective, and that I want to share here, is that, some people ask often, how are we able to differentiate in our lives if something is a trial for us or is a punishment for us, right? And there is a lot of struggle. Like, there's no, how can you tell? Like, it doesn't come with that label, right?
Mhm.
But the only thing that could possibly help you differentiate, and of course this is where your free will also comes in,
Right.
and your practice also comes in, is that it take you away from your creator, or did it take you to the creator, right? Did it bring you closer to your creator? Did it take you away from them?
Mm.
And um, again, this is where your active choice of, what am I going to do with this, right?
Mhm.
Because there's so many of us that are going through something very similar. We're all experiencing collective grief right now, and an individual struggle with it as well.
Mhm.
How are we going to cope with this? Are we going to use this as something that Allah chose for us to experience and go through? And see, since He's never going to choose what is wrong or bad for us, even
Right.
though it is super, super difficult, it is not wrong for us, or it's not bad for us. It feels bad, but it is not bad, right? And that's the faith that we would practice. And then we say, okay, well, this is heavy. I can't breathe.
Mm.
Let me hold your hand. So let me roll out my prayer mat, and let me just do some tasbih, and, just call out to you, and that
Mhm.
soothes me, right?
Yeah.
So simple practices, the ones that you shared as well, earlier on, where just calling out to him by his name, and just, I feel like that's just way of everybody's different understanding and perspectives, but he didn't need 99 names. We needed them, right?
Mhm.
He
True.
doesn't need prayer. We do. So it's all really soothing mechanisms for us, our mind and our heart, right? And our bodies, to engage ourselves in these practices, even rituals that we can participate in as a community, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
The congregations that we hold, the protests that we go out to, the gatherings, the when we make a mention of it with our friends, right? When we give charity, so we're giving something of ourselves for this cause. That kind of layers back on top of our reassurance and our affirmation of, this is what I identify with, and I'm giving some part of my life to this, right?
Mhm.
Not just in suffering, but also like, okay, I'm going to give life to this instead of that, right?
Right.
um, that can really, the behavior of it can really help us affirm to ourselves, okay, this is something new that's come into my life, and this is a deciding moment. So let me decide in consistency, where am I going to stand? And each time you take that one step, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to run to a decision or run to a way of coping or
Mhm.
participating. It just has to be consistent, right? So, yeah. Um, I want to ask you this, and I think this segues perfectly into this question. Whatever we're talking about right now is, how do you make meaning of grief in your life?
Mhm.
How do you make room for it? Like,
Yeah. So, meaning making from grief, it's definitely one of the it's part of that post traumatic growth kind of thing that you once the dust settles and you're out of that initial, and it could take years, right? And the thing I always start this conversation with is that self compassion, that you don't have to make meaning of it right away.
Mm,
I think we sometimes expect ourselves to, like, just suffered a loss, whatever kind of loss it was, and I need to find the wisdom and the meaning of it right now.
yeah,
That's not a realistic expectation. And this whole topic of grief, we have to talk about self-compassion as part of it. It just goes hand in hand that
yeah,
you don't have to be at your full functional self a week later or a month later or a year later or however long later it takes. It's that we have to understand the weight of what we've just experienced. And for us to be realistic about our capabilities and our functioning doesn't mean we don't try to improve those aspects of ourselves, but it means that I don't hold myself to an impossible standard and that I acknowledge and make room and hold space for what I've just been through. Like honor yourself, like you're a human being who's just been through something really hard and having that compassion for yourself. And if you're witnessing someone going through that grief, having so much compassion for them every day will be different. You'll be like,
yeah,
oh, yesterday I was just able to do all this, and today I'm in bed all day, right? And to just acknowledge that compassion piece, that
mm,
this is something it's a very human, raw experience to go through grief, and it will hit us in different ways, and we'll all be
yeah,
very different at it. But when we're focused on, I need to know the wisdom, I need to know the meaning of this. What does this mean? What is this, going to look like? That just puts us again, we're not focused anymore on the coping, we're focused
yeah,
more on the intellectualizing it, which takes time, and sometimes people don't get that meaning till years later,
yeah,
many years later, and sometimes well-meaning people even like at the Aza, like at that three, how in Islam, how we have such a beautiful aspect of community support. Like after someone passes away,
yeah,
there's 3 days where people come and they're pretty much supposed to hold that person
yeah,
when they can't hold their own weight emotionally, physically, and spiritually. But what tends to happen sometimes is people just give a lot of the spiritual stuff, like this is meant to be, this is how it was always supposed to be, like Allah will give you something better, and this isn't saying that these things aren't true. It's just that in that moment, that person is not ready yet to jump to that. Sometimes it's comforting. Sometimes people will need that and want that to stabilize them.
yeah,
But again, you just really have to know the person that you're going to support
yeah,
to know if that's actually what they need or not. So
yeah,
when we jump to the meaning making, when we haven't fully processed the emotions and processed this event properly, we won't be in a healthy state of mind to do that.
yeah,
That's where people then will fall into, I don't see the meaning in this. This is
mm,
just a punishment for me, and I don't
mm,
I don't think I'll ever get through this, or I'll ever be able to get to a place where I can get through it. And the way
yeah,
I explain it to people is that your grief, sometimes we think once the grief gets smaller, I'll be able to make meaning. And I always like to be realistic and say the grief might very well not get smaller. So let's be realistic. You might continue to feel that grief. What we have to do is we have to get bigger.
yeah,
So the grief will be there. It's like this big thing that I'm holding in my heart. I have to get bigger and grow around it. I'm not going
yeah,
to grow over it. I'm going to grow around it. So it continues to be a part of our lives. And that's why we need to be so, I'm always like, be kind to everyone you meet. You have no idea what kind of grief they're holding in their
yeah,
heart while they're trying to get through their day. So we hold that grief, we grow around it, and we keep going
yeah,
in our life to the point where initially that grief might be staring you right in the face and you can't see beyond it. But what happens with grief work and therapy and processing that emotion is that eventually that grief shifts to the side a little bit and you're able to see so much more. That's when
yeah,
meaning making happens. But that could take
yeah,
a really long time for people to get.
yeah,
And there's no time limit, there's no specific date
um,
or a year later this will happen. So just honor that for yourself. Eventually you'll get there, but don't expect that of yourself too soon.
yeah. Absolutely. I agree with what you have said, and it can be so disorienting when something is blocking your view the entire time, right? You don't know what to reference your own position with. It's just all you see. And
Yeah.
so that is one reason why it's so confusing to make sense of it. But just have to be with it that time. There is a question in the chat that says from Sabah, it says sometimes the grief or struggle can be so overwhelming that despite having the knowledge, that there is sense there the knowledge there is this sense of hopelessness reflecting on the stories. can get one more into this approach of those are good times or those are good stories to listen to. Those days were different and those people were different when you're talking about the stories from the Prophet's life. How can we help ourselves and others who may get into that zone because that feeling can be very strong in that moment?
Yeah, and I know it's really hard, and those in the moment strategies will be very different for everyone. Some people, yeah, they'll be like, "I know what you're saying, and I believe it full-heartedly," but in those moments where I'm swept by the grief, I can't I can't see through that moment, and I don't know what to do, and I feel complete helplessness, and my heart feels heavy. And that's where one of the main things we have to do is to avoid that isolation, right? We don't do well in isolation when we're grieving. Our grief has to be witnessed, right? Our grief has to be seen and supported by others. So for you to have some sort of even like I call it like a crisis plan or safety plan or grief
Mm,
plan even during those moments where I am at my lowest, which I know will happen. Again, be realistic and expect that you will have those really, really low moments where it's like the anniversary or something or a special occasion or something happens that just it's a really bad day. You can start to anticipate those days. Some days you'll be able to anticipate and plan, like, I need to make sure I have someone with me that day. I need to make sure I book that day off work,
yeah.
whatever it is that you need to do to cope with that day. Some days it'll happen and you'll have no preparation for it. So it's those in the moment strategies where, again, we have these anchors, and they're things that we've practiced outside of those moments, so that when we're in those moments, they're readily accessible to us, and they help us so much more. So again, a lot of that will come down to things that ground us and anchor us in that moment. It's almost like you're drifting off into the wind and something's coming and putting you back here on earth. So that'll be different. Some people, they know to kind of remove themselves from that immediate environment and go outside. They go for a run. I know people that
Yeah.
running is their primary coping strategy, or walking, taking a shower, washing their face with cold water, um, doing different things that just sometimes they just sit down and they just really just feel their feet on the floor and just acknowledge that, okay, I am here. It's November the 22nd, 2024. I am probably going back into the past, into a different
Yeah.
stage of my life, or I'm going to the future, right? And so we're oscillating between future and the past, and that grief is just it's like this wave again. Like I said, that's kind of taking us underwater, and you're trying to bring yourself back here. I'm here. I'm in my home. I'm safe. I am grieving. Like acknowledge for yourself, I am going through a very, very
Yeah.
difficult moment. I am triggered, right? Just acknowledging I am triggered by something right now. There isn't a real threat, but I am grieving and I need to hold space for that. And sometimes, yeah, just really holding yourself. Like
Yeah.
physically, some people will literally just hold themselves in that moment,
Yeah.
or ask somebody to come and hold them because you just want to feel like you're basically intellectualizing won't help as much. That's why you're right. Like sometimes reminding yourself of these stories won't help, but your body
Yeah.
has to feel that safety first before your mind can. And that's why
Yeah.
you're doing these different somatic type
Yeah.
of practices or coping mechanisms that involve your breathing, that involve your body,
Yeah.
involve that anchoring and that grounding. Send your brain the message that I've got this. I can handle
Yeah.
this. I will get through it.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just like to add to, this perspective of, oh, those were different times. This is a different time. Again, like you said, this is more of going into that intellectualizing bit. Um, it's just that information contrast is very vivid at that time, and they're like, "Oh, I'm gonna block this with my intellect because I'm not ready for this."
Right.
The reason why most of the times that also happens with people and they reject a consolation uh, to their emotions is because this is an intellectual
Mhm.
soothing, right? Here, let me offer you a story. Somebody else went through this as well. You won't be able to connect with somebody else's story using your empathy, right? And this ability to connect with another person when you don't know what you're connecting
Mm.
to them with. Like you don't know what part of you will connect with their part.
Yeah.
You don't know your grief yet, so you can't connect with another person's grief yet.
Mm.
That's very difficult. And that's also one of the barriers to offering support for somebody who is grieving. So we try to offer them stories of whatever we know, right? Not what we have felt. Because in order for you to show up for somebody emotionally who is grieving, you also have to open up yourself and make yourself vulnerable to that process of, okay, I haven't experienced grief, but I've experienced sadness and deep sorrow and helplessness in my life sometime, and I'm going to open myself up to see what they're seeing right now, right? And
Mhm.
that is seeing somebody or witnessing somebody in their grief.
Yeah.
You don't have to have had the same experience, but you can definitely recount something similar in your life and then, offer empathy from that point of view. So that person grieving is not going to be able to take in that story yet because they don't know what they're going through emotionally. And that's like if you're speaking from a therapeutic lens or a neurological lens, that's your midbrain. If
Yeah.
your midbrain is not satisfied, it won't allow you, it will literally block your neural pathways that are going to your intellectual part, which is right here in the front of your brain, right?
Yeah.
So you have to really connect with the emotions first. Some people might find these stories soothing because you're taking it from the perspective of the emotions,
Yeah.
not the intellect of, hey, what happened and what did they do? Maybe what they
Mhm.
felt, right? And that's where they could connect. So, of course, you can connect with the Sira at any level, but you also have to be honest with yourself. Well, what do you need? Do you need an intellectual soothing or do you need an emotional soothing, right?
Right.
Something going inward. So, just really recognizing your blueprint of grief, really,
Mhm.
because one thing that we use to give perspective to clients when they're grieving is that your grieving process is as unique as your fingerprint.
Yeah.
Nobody
Mhm.
will ever know what you're going through except for you and your creator, right? And this is where your creator is going to sustain you. So,
Yeah.
yeah, wonderful question. We're almost at the end. Is there any last things that you would want to say before we leave, Runda, or is there any questions you can say in the chat from the audience?
I guess until we get another question, I just like to leave people with kind of like a practical takeaway that helps us during those hard moments, whether we're grieving or just going through a difficult time. Um, and it's this concept of if I can't like we sometimes focus so hard on how do I get rid of this feeling? How do I get rid of the bad stuff, right? All the stress in my life, all the overwhelm, all the difficulties. And we focus so much on that when a lot
Mhm.
of that's out of our control. Even a lot of this, some of our stressors are within our control. And we can put boundaries, we can delegate, we can put things aside. But there's a lot of stressors in our life that are attached to things that we really love, that we don't want to let go of, like our jobs, our families, right? These are things that do provide an element of overwhelm in our life and a lot of pouring into that can sometimes deplete us. And if you're dealing with grief, you're pouring from a much emptier cup, right? So
Mhm.
just to remember that. So what I like to focus on instead is when I can't necessarily remove or get rid of the bad stuff, the difficult stuff in my life, I focus on where I can add more good. Where can I add more of the good stuff, right? And it's that sense that the pain that we feel and the hardship and our heartache that we have in our life, that becomes part of our story. Like that becomes part of our life story. And I can't just remove that without removing a part of myself. Like it's
Yeah,
intertwined in my being.
yeah,
So what I can do is I can start adding more of the good that will make all that pain less prominent in my life where it's not the only
yeah,
thing I'm seeing in my life. So what is more of that good? It's doing the things that the basics, right? The things that help us feel a better state of well-being, our sleep, our exercise, our nutrition, our relationships, right? That huge study that talked about the number one factor that influences our well-being is the quality of our relationships. Spending more time with people that we love, more remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, doing things that make you forget to check your phone, right? Doing things that make you feel like you've lost track of time, things that you enjoy, incorporate
yeah,
play in your life, right? So you're incorporating more things that aren't necessarily adding more to your plate, that are more on your to-do list, but it's those daily consistent habits. I always say like we need to develop these daily consistent habits in our life that keep us well
yeah,
so that when we're hit with these storms, we're able to stand upright instead of us completely falling over. But they have to be consistently done in our lives. And they're very small things that you
yeah,
can add in your day. So when you can't figure out how to get rid of the bad, stressful things, think about how you can add more of the good stuff that you are in control over.
yeah. And I really like how you added that um, perspective of like compassionately also recognizing that this is not to shut off or block yourself from the awareness of the bad has also happened, your hurt as well, but just keeping that in your awareness and then saying, okay, how much room do I have to add something nice in my life or positive, or just that's going to take away some of the stressor.
Right.
It's probably going to add something like a cushion for you to be able to then look at the hurt as well, because this is true, right? For us, we we're not going to be able to, reduce our capacity for feeling one kind of emotion and then increase the capacity for feeling another kind of emotion. That's not how it is. Like
Right.
if you are if you're suppressing hurt and you're not allowing yourself to feel that feeling, then your brain is also not going to allow you to feel joy either, right?
Mhm. Yep.
And so this is a very good coping mechanism in that neurological sense as well, that if you are unable to expose yourself to the hurt that's literally making it difficult for you to breathe, see if you can create more experiences of joy. And with that depth of joy, maybe you'll be able to go back to the hurt and experience a little bit more of that as well,
Right.
right? So yeah, it's it goes both ways, really.
Mhm.
So thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation with us. I really enjoyed talking to you and learning from you today. And I'm sure everybody listening in as well. We're able to engage our audience, and I'm really glad that we got to see some reflections and a wonderful question here as well. And I hope that we will be keeping in touch and making use of your knowledge and your perspective in the future as well.
Inshallah. Thank you for having me. Jazakumullah khair. It was really nice having this conversation, and inshallah, we'll be able to have more of them.
Inshallah. Take care of yourself, Runda, and thank you everybody who stayed till the very end as well.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.